Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We're almost there to the end of the show, but this segment is a very interesting segment because we have a Western Conference Finals game tonight between the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Dallas Mavericks. After a highly interesting game one where we saw Kyrie Irving step up, Luka Doncic step up later in the game, and Ant Edwards be almost silent. I think that Game 2 is going to be a very interesting one in terms of betting trends, but also in terms of fantasy projections. So we'll start with fantasy projections on DraftKings this time. I did FanDuel for the hockey, but this is DraftKings for basketball. So starting off with the two stars, Luka Doncic, 13.4K valuation on the market. He's expected to have 58.5 DraftKings fantasy points. And then Anthony Edwards for the Minnesota Timberwolves, 11.4K valuation, 49.5 DraftKings fantasy points. But also, keep in mind that Kyrie Irving's a little bit on the cheaper side tonight, also at 11.4K valuation, 41 projected DraftKings fantasy points. I think that is quite the steal from the way he played in Game 1. Looking at the betting odds for tonight's game, we have Minnesota at -5.5. They're favored by 5.5 at home. The over-under is 207.5. And the money lines are Dallas plus 185 and Minnesota minus 220. So coming off that game 1, I'm really interested in the way Kyrie Irving played because of how he was able to attack Minnesota's drop coverage, one of the most suffocating defenses in the league, and make them pay attention to his versatility as a point guard. So I just wanted to shout out Kyrie Irving because of his ability to exploit that drop coverage when Minnesota decides to drop deeper into the paint to mitigate for when Luka Doncic wants to drive and all his mid-range prowess. So I just wanted to underline the fact that I feel like Kyrie Irving right now is being overlooked in Game 2 because of what he did in Game 1. I think that he is the best fantasy prospect right now in terms of what he can do based off of what Minnesota presented in terms of defense. And on Minnesota's side of the ball, I feel that they're kind of hard done by. I don't think this is Game 1 was one of those games where, one team really outplayed the other. I just think it came down to more detail-oriented plays from the Dallas Mavericks based off of their offensive game plan and who they are as a team, rather than any misgivings I have about the Minnesota defense. I think that the Minnesota defense still played a fantastic game, but it's just the ability of players like Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving who can set the tone for a team like Dallas. But looking at a player like Ant, who has been kind of absent in terms of where he was in the previous series, I feel like Anthony Edwards is one of those players who, when he's expected to perform, I just feel like he has this innate pressure put on him as the young superstar, the young face of the Minnesota Timberwolves to deliver. And I think that more experienced players in Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving and a more experienced team in the Dallas Mavericks is willing to exploit that. They don't care that Anthony Edwards wants to cement himself as a star of this league. They just want to win the series. And I don't think that Minnesota wants to fall into that trap where they get sucked into Dallas's style of play, because that's not how they want to play. They want to play defense first and have Anthony Edwards, Rudy Gobert, and Karl Anthony Towns provide on the offensive side of the ball in whatever ways they can. Another big aspect of Game 1 that I think is going to be questioned in Game 2 is the play of Dallas's role players. I think that Dallas's role players are very pivotal to how they play. I think that guys like Derek Lively and Dan Gafford need more minutes in order to continue to combat the paint presence on the defensive end of both Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns. So, that being said, look for Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford as cheaper fantasy options, maybe that you can rotate into your team tonight because of who I think they can be in this series. That being said, let's look ahead at some of the player prop bets that I think are going to be very important. I think that Luka Doncic, it all starts with him tonight. I think that tonight he will have over 30.5 points. Kind of took a little bit of a backseat to Kyrie, but that was mainly, in my mind, how the Dallas Mavericks wanted to set up their offensive game plan because of what they saw in the Minnesota defense. I think that Luka will always get his own in games like this. I think that he's not to be overlooked. And ultimately, I think that he will have a higher level of production tonight rather than in game one, where he kind of brought it on later on in the game and had Kyrie take over the first half. In terms of Anthony Edwards, I just don't see him going over 25 points tonight. I think that what Minnesota needs to focus on to win this series is creating opportunities through their defense. I think that they're one of the best defenses in the league, mainly because not only do they shut you down, but they can force turnovers. And that's how I think they're going to get easy points against the Dallas Mavericks. When the Dallas Mavericks set their defense, I do think they're better prepared for what Anthony Edwards, Rudy Gobert, and Karl Anthony Towns can deliver. We saw it last game. So ultimately, I feel like the Minnesota Timberwolves offense is going to be quicker, which does not necessarily, in my mind, suit Anthony Edwards. I think that it's going to be more of a paint-based game. I think that the Minnesota Timberwolves are going to focus on getting into the paint and making things tough for the Dallas role players in the paint tonight. So I just feel that Anthony Edwards is going to be impacted by that. So I'm going to go with the under. In terms of role players, I'm going to say Derek Lively goes over 6.5 rebounds tonight. I think that Derek Lively's a very interesting player. Lives up to his name every night. He's a very lively player. But ultimately, I just think that he is willing to do whatever it takes for Dallas to get to the finals this year. I think that he's a very nice addition to what they already had. Fits so well into the team. Helps add to the fact that Dallas wants to also pay attention to defense as well. They're not just an offensive-oriented team centered around Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. They can focus on the defensive end as well. And I think that Derek Lively will be a big part of that tonight. So look out for him to be on the offensive and defensive boards all night long, harassing Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns down low. Speaking of both Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns, I think that Rudy Gobert is going to have 3.5 blocks tonight. I think that he needs to be more active on the boards for the Timberwolves to tie the series up. I also think that Karl Anthony Towns is going to have, in my opinion, over 3.5 three-pointers. I think that Karl Anthony Towns' offense last game was something that stood out to me. I think that he is going to try and stretch the floor for Minnesota, get guys like Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford further out of the paint so that Rudy Gobert can attack, run the pick and roll between him and Gobert. So I think that Karl Anthony Towns will be heavily effective in this game tonight. Also, I'm looking at a guy in Naz Reid who did not have as big a game as I thought he was going to. He's a very key player, mainly in clutch situations, but overall I think he's going to have a bigger night tonight. So I do think that I would lay off him tonight in terms of daily fantasy because of how volatile he is in terms of whether or not he's going to get bigger minutes down the stretch. So Naz Reid, I say bench him tonight. Another player who I think is going to be a no from me in terms of daily fantasy is Jaden McDaniels. I do not think he's going to keep producing the way he is for the rest of the series. I just think that Dallas, from what I saw in Game 1, is willing to squeeze all the players deeper into the perimeter, try and stop them before they drive into the paint. And I think that Jaden McDaniels is not going to benefit from that as someone who wants to stretch the floor for Minnesota. So I'm very wary of him as a daily fantasy pick. But that should just about do it for this segment in terms of Wolves-Mavs. Again, looking forward to this game. Think that this is going to be a very even matchup in terms of who I expect to come out on top. I think that, like I said, Game 1 was more of a testing ground. Nothing much was learned about the team except for the fact that Kyrie Irving was willing to attack. I think tonight Kyrie Irving is my fantasy player pick, is someone to look out for. But overall, I just think that Anthony Edwards and Rudy Gobert and Karl Anthony Towns want to come out for their hometown crowd and get back home court advantage, make this an even series. So, that being said, I am picking the Timberwolves to win tonight's game. I think that ultimately they will also win the next 2 games, taking one from Dallas on the road. I'm looking further ahead, but that should just about do it for this segment. Coming up as our last segment of the day, we are going to be looking at something very exciting. I did the QBs for the NFL ESPN rankings. I did the running backs. Today we look at the wide receivers. So stick around for that segment. We will be right back.